Welcome to Sundays with Stories. This is a podcast brought to you by the Life Process Program, or LPP. The LPP is an online addiction coaching program. We deal with a range of issues that people might have, not only to drugs, but involvements in their lives that they feel preoccupied by, and maybe just need to articulate their issues, or perhaps need to articulate and get responses from a trained coach at our Life Process Program. This podcast that we do sort of distinguishes us from other addiction groups or addiction counselors or clinicians out there, in that we deal with the whole person. We deal with people's experiences and we take them as they are. So if you were to work with us in our program, you would come to us with your issues judgment free from us, and we try to work with you to figure out what you want and what you need and what you need to do to get there. Usually we have a story for you, a story from either the media or that we have that we've seen in our lives, and we respin it back to reality, in a way that the media perhaps hasn't portrayed it before. And there are always stories related to addiction, but I'm going to save that for the end. We're going to tell a story about Phil Collins and his drinking issues. First, today, I want to begin by answering questions that people have posed. We have a Facebook group, a Life Process Program discussion group. And people who listen to the podcast and people who interact with that group have been having really cool conversations, really thoughtful. And I thought that I'd pose some of those questions here. Before I do that, I should introduce that I'm with Dr. Stanton Peele, the creator of the Life Process Program. How you doing, Stanton?
Very good to be with you, Zach.
So, hey, this is sort of impromptu for you, but I wanted to, something I've been thinking about because people have been discussing. One person wrote to me personally, and they saw our podcast talking about an AA adage. What was it that we talked about? Something in AA. Oh, it was taking a personal inventory. And we discussed the, there's some wisdom in trying to recount things that have happened to you by virtue of your addiction, but you don't want to get bogged down and, you don't want to go down the rabbit hole of flogging yourself for every wrong that you've done. You want to make progress. So we discussed that.
And we talked about how in the Life Process Program, we give people the skills to go out to interact with others to find, it's not right. You don't want to self-flagellate and just say, oh, look at all the wrongs I've done. This is an ongoing relationship in many cases with your family. And you need techniques and outlook and some skills that you can use to remedy those kinds of problems and have a more productive ongoing relationship, which is what the Life Process Program is about. It's like starting where you're at and, without gushing through your memories of failure, saying, well, we're here now. How do we, in the here and now, progress in our lives to make it our addictions less of a fulcrum for all that we do.
So this is a person who, very well said, and this is a person who's keyed into that phenomenon that there are things that are written in AA that on the surface sound sensible, and maybe to some extent they can be sensible. So he was asking about a different AA adage, but before I even get there, we were talking about how, you can have a slogan, it could sound nice, it could be totally meaningless. Like, you remember "No Child Left Behind." Is anyone in favor of leaving children behind? Support our troops. Is anybody against all the troops? So So this person's asking about, what do we think about the idea of one day at a time? It's so vague, so nice sounding. You get to narrow your frame.
With one day at a time is it's a way of translating the AA concept that you're one drink away from completely collapsing your entire recovery in your entire life. As you're aware, if you have a taste of alcohol, you have to come back to AA and start from ground zero. And so everything you've done, not only your whole life, but everything you've done within, let's call AA, a group, a therapy group, is meaningless. And of course, that's the opposite thought from harm reduction. Harm reduction is a way of zeroing in on a more successful way of dealing with your life. And if you have some problems in that journey, that doesn't mean that you haven't learned anything. That doesn't mean that you haven't progressed. It means that there's a slip. Alan Marlatt used the term a slip rather than a full relapse. And you're prepared to learn from that and to proceed further. So the one day at a time has you like hovering over a cliff that you're just about to fall off of. Whereas the Life Process Program and harm reduction psychotherapy is we're on a journey. We've learned quite a bit. We accept that we're not perfect. We're trying to maintain our improvements and to utilize new skills and ways of thinking. And in fact, even on their own, most human beings progress in that way. Most people are more constructive and successful dealing with themselves and others in their 30s than their 20s and proceeding into their 50s and so on. So we're just encouraging a natural life process. This is where we got our name.
Let's say that a different way by, I don't want to even say devil's advocate. I'm not going to play the part of AA, but I'll play the part of somebody who picks up on that phrase and says, this is useful. Why could it be useful? Well, you could imagine a time that you have so much going on, so much that you're planning. You're looking at a lifelong adventure of something that you want to do or a lifelong goal, and that could be overwhelming. So narrowing your frame to the moment that you're in existence is sort of like a stoic or even mindful way of thinking about things. Sometimes you need to zero in on what's going on right now and pay attention to that so that you don't get overwhelmed with things that haven't happened yet or have happened previously. That's a mindful way of thinking. What you're saying is that smuggled in with that concept, with that phrase, is the entire AA ideology pulled into it, which says that really to be successful, you need to not drink, you need to not do drugs, you need to remain what they call sober. So saying one day at a time is a way of saying you need to continue not drinking, you need to continue staying sober if you're going to do anything with your life. But look, focus on staying sober today. And the problem with that is that even though it does that, it presents the mindful element of focusing on the here and now, it also discludes the idea that perhaps, so say you've been on a progressive journey for 6 months and then you have a drink. Well, they say that if you have a drink on that day, start from square one. They don't say all of the things that you've learned along the way. Just lock that in your gains and think about, like you said, Alan Marlatt called it a slip. Think about this thing as a slip and then, carry on. We at the Life Process Program might not even call that a slip. I mean, it's only a slip if you didn't want to drink. We might say, all right, you drink. So, alcohol is a thing. People drink it. And why did you decide to drink? Did that have benefits for you? Did it detract from your experience or what? So I guess the problem with one day at a time is A, that it's incomplete, and B, doesn't when people are in favor of it, they're not usually saying, I'm in favor of this because it maps onto the whole A ideology.
And it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you've convinced yourself that a slip means that you've lost everything, you're more likely to just jump off the cliff. And more fundamentally, it pictures you as tottering on the edge of a cliff, rather than as a human being who has the ability to go gracefully forward and to mature and to improve yourself, even though we don't want to become arrogant and not recognize our own imperfection. And so it's not really a buoying up of yourself and a looking forward. I mean, the concept that we hear that more accurately describes what we're talking about is living in the here and now. It's not living in the here and now. The AA, one day at a time, is imagining, oh, your horrible the weight that you're carrying that's about to topple you over. Living in the here and now is saying, okay, we're here now. This is the world that we're facing. Let's both enjoy it and deal with it responsibly. It comes from the kind of Buddhist philosophy of self-acceptance and yet positivity towards yourself and the universe.
Brilliant. Anything else you want to add on that point?
No, I think we've thrown the ideas, the philosophy. I mean, I guess one thing I want to say is it's amazing how these kind of worldviews underlie what a phrase means and how we approach things. I'm not here to convert people to Buddhism, but it's a kind of an opposite sense of your place in the universe from the kind of heavily Protestantly, religiously, Christianity-oriented, temperance-oriented vision that AA has. And that underlying outlook and philosophy is a critical thing in and of itself.
Yeah. So here's this is not so much a question, but just the question here is I worked with a client and she's given me permission not to name her, but to just explain some of her story and how she overcame excessive eating, or at least one dimension of her excessive eating. And she wanted to hear from you and or me to share if we've had if we have ideas about this one, or if we've experienced other people who have had similar encounters. And third, she wants to know if we have an idea about how this is universal, not just with food, but how this could work with drugs or alcohol. So her story is that she was really trying to diet. She was very overweight, but by the time I was talking to her, she had lost a lot of weight, and I think over 100 pounds. And one thing that she was doing in the mornings was she stopped at whatever the Canadian equivalent of Dunkin', what is it called? Not Dunkin', Tim Hortons in the morning, and she'd get donuts and bagels and, coffees, and she just ate them all. And one thing that she did that was easy for her, she got up a little earlier. She made herself like a protein-filled breakfast, and she continued to stop at that Tim Hortons, and she would get just a regular coffee, and that was enough for her. And she went about it. She didn't really change anything else. And just by making that change in the morning, that sort of set her up. She didn't have to think about anything else, but she said kind of naturally throughout the day, she remembered that she took that big step in the morning to take care of herself, and she wanted to kind of add on to it throughout the day. So she sort of had a natural recovery because she reoriented her morning. Her issue was she kind of had on the back end of her day, her work day, she would drive by this strip that had McDonald's, Burger King's, and she just associated those things with her drive home. She would always be tired, so she said, the soda, just the idea of the soda and having caffeine was good. And she had a really hard time driving by those places and just not stopping to get burgers. And she would go by, 3 different fast food places and get all the stuff that she wanted, and she got home. So she was thinking about this as like, if there was a Skid Row or something that I had to go by, I probably would just go around it so I didn't have to involve myself with drugs if she was addicted to drugs. In this case, this is just, she has to go to work, and there's no really good way around. She has to take this bypass. She has to go by these places. And so the way we talked through this, and we talked about when you land at home, what's your night like? So I sort of reflected, you made a change based on your morning routine at home. What's your routine at home when you get home from work? And she started explaining it to me. And then she sort of realized, I think I live alone and I get bored and I can't think of anything really to do with my night. I just want to relax, and whatever relaxation means. So she relaxes with all this food and watching Netflix. So she does various things now. We don't have to get into all of it, but she's kind of set her house up into different stations where she could do constructive things, relaxing things. And it took a little while, but just the idea that she can get home and there are places to relax and things to do that she's planned out, she had said that just gave her success. She really didn't have to focus on the food, or I'm not stopping for the food, or I want the food. She just really needed to focus on the next level, which is once I get home, what am I going to do? And once that was more enjoyable, she doesn't really think about it anymore. So her question really is, have you, I'm trying to, it's a little bit abstract, but I think you understand. Have you had these encounters with other people who the way to ameliorate their problems isn't so on the nose? Like, it's not like you should avoid bars or you should avoid drugs, but it's more what else is going on in your life. And then she wanted to know if that you've dealt with people like that with not just food things, but also drugs, sex, whatever.
Well, I guess three points occur to me right up top. The first is she is making the case for dealing with overeating and related issues, health issues, in the same fashion as dealing with drug and alcohol addiction, which is already what the Life Process program is about. Mm-hmm. We mentioned the great Alan Wallach died about 5 years ago. His relapse prevention program combined heroin, eating, smoking, drinking, and gambling, I think. And he, at some points, gave me credit for putting them all in the same basket. And she is giving an ideal way, or is exemplifying how those kinds of behaviors are all fall in the category of what we would call addictions. The second thing I would point out is that, she's been successful. I mean, if you've lost 100 pounds, you're a little bit of a role model, and we have a lot to learn from you, although you have a lot of faith to dedicate to yourself and say, well, I've, accomplished a pretty remarkable thing. And it's these larger concepts, how you view yourself, how you view your ability to influence your life, how you activate your motivation. I mean, obviously, somebody who's lost 100 pounds probably needed to do something very helpful for herself. And she came to a realization that that was the case. So, and there's nothing that can replace that. I mean, when it gets down to it, it's motivational interviewing, and the Life Process program says, well, let's think about who you are and what you really want in life and how you're going to better direct yourself to that goal. There's no getting around who you want to be, and what your values are and what your purpose is in life. So I hope I've made 2 points. One, the generality of the addiction approach. 2, over the larger variables in your life. And then we get down to 3, which is like dietary tricks. And unlike some programs, we focus first on self-efficacy, your ability to affect your life, your larger purpose and your larger values, and bringing them in line. Then come techniques, but for a therapy or a therapist to say, oh, why don't you do X or Y? Well, why don't you eat lettuce for lunch or something like that? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So ask backwards, because no therapist is going to know the inner workings of an individual's life. Like, she outlined her ride and her commute and how she reacts to the McDonald's and all. You can never know that. And she, in the morning framework, came up with she ate a healthy breakfast. She went to the same place, which is harm reduction. It's the opposite of AA. Well, don't go into a bar. And now she had modified her way of interacting with that setting, which she enjoyed, by her own behaviors in line with where she wanted to go. So if you're being a helper, you would, and she says, well, at the tail end of the day, which is exactly what you did as a skilled life process coach, well, you sort of already have dealt with this issue at the beginning of your day. how can we translate that skill into dealing with the end of your day, which she had already begun to do, or that you helped her to do, which is how to fill that time in a more constructive way. I don't know, this might actually be point four. Addiction is not a problem that people have so much with a thing. Addiction is a failure to relate positively to your overall life. And, you asked exactly the right question, which is, when you're tempted to relapse around food, what actually is the life environment you're looking at? And like many, many people, she lives alone. The positive options in life, you have to ferret them out. You have to think what it is you want to do that's positive, which you did with her around individual activities and individual places, in her life. And those things are all laying latent. She knows what she likes. She knows what the alternatives are, but she needs some encouragement or interaction around thinking how she's actually going to fill those things, which is it's a very existential question. It's like, what is valuable in my life? How am I going to bring that to the forefront? How am I going to make that the primary thing? And once life process program is a theory of connections, and involvement and engagement. We've talked about Jane Pauley engaging with her life. There's a lot to engage with in life, but we lose track of it. We become discouraged. We get preoccupied with other things. And that's the goal of the life process program, is to be engaged in as many positive inclinations as you have. And the more successfully you do that, the less likely you are to be addicted. That's obviously not how great a cheeseburger at McDonald's is, or all those pastries that she avoided in the morning were, or how super alcohol is. It's the alternatives that you're not pursuing, which are both source and the remedy for your addictive over-reliance.
Now, I have a confession. One of the reasons I wanted to share this is because I was proud of my ability to resist offering suggestions when they popped into my mind. She's actually a good enough storyteller. She gets so detailed with how she's feeling in a moment that I kind of feel like I'm there. And I had to remind myself a few times of my purpose in this conversation. I think that being a good clinician, in some ways, you kind of want to be able to retell the story, and people ask, like, well, why were you even there? She did it. Because that's the trajectory we want people to go, sort of get within themselves and try to figure out what makes sense in their lives. So I just want to share a couple tricks to bring it to a meta level, I guess, that I used. First of all, the first trick I stole from you. You've asked in the past, people are trying to kick drug addictions, and then they tell you that they quit smoking early on in their lives, and they kind of breeze by that. So, yeah, well, I quit smoking, but now with drugs, and you can say, well, hold on. So you've already quit an addiction. And so how did that work out? And you tell them. So I thought about, all right, how do you link this concept? So she's already telling me that she's already worked out a way that she makes her day better and more healthful. So I was able to stop and say, good, you've already made the beginning of your day more healthful. Let's think about the dynamics of that. Let's try to plug that in, use that template and bookend your day with these, healthy things. So that was like a suggestion, but a suggestion to think about how she already did something and borrow from that. That was a good Stanton Peele trick, a good clinical trick. But another thing was that when she was talking about her drive home, I was tempted to brainstorm and offer ideas. And there are good times for that, but I don't think good times for that are in a clinical one-on-one setting. She talked about wanting to get to the gym more, and that she had a hard time doing that during her day. And then sort of in the next breath was talking about her drive home. And I felt like saying, do you drive by any gyms on the way home? And, I might have done that if I wasn't really if I wasn't present. And I was so tempted to say things that I decided maybe I can sort of say something, but I will do what Chris Voss, is an FBI negotiator, calls an accusations audit. So I said, you're such a good storyteller that I'm tempted to, I feel like I'm there. So I'm tempted to shout out to you some of the ideas I might have if I were in that situation, because you've made it easy for me to do that. Stop me if I'm ever going to do that, because I know the last thing that you might want is me rattling off suggestions that you've already thought about. And so that I put it on the table so I wasn't tempted anymore. And I think that made her feel a little bit more comfortable that that's not the route that I was going to go down. So that was a pretty interesting thing, I think.
Well, that's a less is more therapy approach, where you don't value yourself. This is a fundamental shift in therapy thinking. It's not you making valuable suggestions. It's you pulling back to give the person the space to develop their own thinking, to create their own life resolutions, which is what it's all going to boil down to in life. You're not going to be on that car ride home with her. She has to feel and see and enact these things. So the more you're able to advance her real life thinking in that direction, that's the more helpful you can be.
That was the ultimate success. The other part of that I'm saying is that I think, she says so. I think that when I brought up something that she might be concerned about in sharing this story, I could imagine she would be concerned. I've told this kind of story before. People always offer advice. I can never fulfill it. So I just put that on the table and addressed it and said, I bet I could imagine that you would be concerned that, I'm going to rattle off suggestions. And I think that step made her feel involved in the process and less worried that was going to happen. And that's something new that I'm trying, is to, instead of holding those things in and perhaps them manifesting somewhere down the line, I tried to explain where I am, but I put it in her terms.
That reminds me of a story. At the University of Wisconsin, where Alan Marley got his PhD, they developed a fellowship. And when they created that fellowship, they invited a group of addiction people around to talk about addiction issues. And one of the people there was Timothy Baker's, very famous research clinician. And he said, we were trying to come up with a technique for quitting smoking. And we decided we would combine all the different techniques, behavioral techniques that we had learned. But in the control group, you weren't allowed to do that. You weren't allowed to say, oh, why don't you, delay the cigarettes, or make it harder to reach the cigarettes, or keep dirty ashtray, all of those things. And instead you had to bite your tongue and just sort of sit there. And when the person said, well, I've been trying to quit smoking for 12 years, or blah, 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 blah. Instead of saying anything, you would have to say, gosh, that sounds awful tough. I wonder how you could possibly, and do all kinds of zero things. And Timothy Baker said, it's remarkable how often the client rushed in to fill that space. Well, they're maybe thinking, well, this guy's not going to be able to come up with anything. Maybe I should be a little bit more active in thinking myself about what I know and what about my life and what resources I've used in the past. So, again, I'm hardly a Buddhist, but there's a stillness approach to problems and interactions with the universe, which doesn't mean passivity. It doesn't mean defeatism. It means allowing space for solutions to evolve. And that's especially true in interacting in coaching and therapy with a client.
Well, first, I just want to say thanks for your feedback on that. And second, so it just doesn't seem like I'm just being self-congratulatory. I just want to say a huge congratulations to this person. I mean, it's just a remarkable success in life, by her own standards. And it makes me really happy to see people making such progress, and that she wanted to share that story and that experience because she thought that maybe other people could benefit from it.
Well, you're a person who doesn't have to boast about your helpfulness. People find you helpful, all kinds of people. And, you've been able to support yourself by being a non-overbearing helper. That's your shtick. And it, seems to be marketable. You've been able to put food on the table for a couple of years and decades now. Looks like it's a winning technique.
Well, thank you. And, we don't have that much time left, but I promised a story. And so I'll just make it a quick one because this is a nice transition into a person who helped himself. One of the things that we try to hone in on and expand upon is natural recovery. It's sort of that story there. But Phil Collins is a person who, people wrote articles about his alcoholism and that he's an alcoholic. And there were some articles that were posted. I can link to a few, and I'll link to this interview that I'm citing. A few articles that are posted that even though he stopped drinking, people still called him an alcoholic because of that mentality that, once you've had a problem, you just always have a problem. He had a
identity.
Right. That's
is an identity therapy. AA is an identity therapy. You are an alcoholic. If there's one fundamental way that we differ from that, we don't label people, we don't identify people or want them to identify themselves by a disease. The disease is the behavior is secondary to who they are in their life.
So there's Phil Collins' own words. And this is a segment that I will share in the links that I think it was about 5 minutes. And he was doing this interview. So I'll read from this. He said, well, in 2005, I sort of retired from music, but I still like to play, but I retired from the road, doing 200 whatever shows a year. And Phil Collins was a drummer, of course, drummer for Genesis, and then he had his own band. Then in 2005, right when he was retiring, so he sort of went away from the thing that gave him meaning for decades. He also got divorced. And he said, I got divorced and things fell apart. And I had 2 young boys. So he had to deal with, like, all right, I was married to this person. Now I no longer have this relationship. And so how do we handle we both want a relationship with these 2 young boys? And he said they kept it pretty cordial and they were able to get along, even though this was a really rough road. But then she and the kids moved to Miami. He was in Switzerland. So it turned from, 10 minutes down the road to see them, or they go 10 minutes down the road to see him, to he had to travel 10 hours away by plane to get to see them. So now, all right, he's retired from music, the thing that gave him his career, and perhaps a sort of identity. He got divorced. He had 2 young boys that he can't see as often. So he said, I just felt like things were falling apart. Aside from that, he was losing strength because he had a condition in his right hand. As a drummer who still wanted to play gigs once in a while, it just wasn't working. So he started taking some painkillers he said he never had an issue with painkillers. He took them for pain as prescribed, but he also started drinking. So he's trying to fill the void that was left by all of these engagements he had in life. And he was drinking a lot, and he was drinking so much, it got in such a habit that he had to wind up having a girlfriend, and also his kids were pleading with him, look, you have to stop. And he said that sometimes he would mix alcohol with the prescription drugs, and that was a bad mix. He learned later on what a deadly mix it could have been. So he said, so once my kids and people in my life that I loved told me I had to stop, I realized, I really do have to stop. And the interviewer said, well, how did you stop? Because people don't just stop like that. Did you go to AA? Or he said, no, I never wanted to be in that club. Didn't say anything else about it. He just kind of brushed it aside. And the guy said, well, did you go to rehab or something? Said, okay, to be honest, I did try out a rehab for a week, and then I went there, and it just wasn't for me. What did you say about that? Yeah, that's all I said. I just didn't feel like I belonged there. They wanted me to tell me that I'm an alcoholic, and I just didn't feel like that. I just drank. And when someone tells me you've got to stop because of your health or because of your family, then I stop. And that is the unremarkable, yet still remarkable, Phil Collins story about how he overcame his alcohol addiction.
Well, I mean, the whole purpose of Sundays for Stories, as you described at the outset, is people don't realize that the large majority of people overcome their addictions on their own. And the problem is they don't have a union.
Yeah.
Collins couldn't go somewhere and say, "Oh, I quit on my own." We talked about Jane Pauley. Jane Pauley doesn't go out and say, I wrote a memoir saying, how I became bipolar at a really bad point in my life. Now she doesn't talk about that at all. And she's not going to do a program. Oh, that whole bipolar thing, maybe I overdid it, or here's how I dealt with it through my family and through my work. There's no avenue to express that. So what we're trying to do is give a megaphone to what is in fact the largest single source for overcoming addiction. And we try and translate it into the Life Process program, which is natural recovery, his values, his relationships, it sounds a lot like the woman with the food, his needing to be constructive in how he fills his time. And when you align those points in your life, that's when you progress and overcome addiction. It's not a matter of, deciding you have a disease and joining a group. And he is like the large majority of people don't go to rehab and AA in the first place. And the people that do go to those things, most people reject them. I mean, I used to go through this calculus when somebody would say, well, AA is the only solution for a drinking problem. I'd say, well, what percentage of people with a drinking problem go to AA or rehab? And so the answer is something like, 15%. And then if you say to them, well, of those people who go to rehab or AA, how many people stick with it? What percentage of them? And the answer is something like 5%. But let's round up or down and say, well, 1 in 10 people with the problem goes to AA or rehab, and he actually went to rehab. And then what percent stick with it? Let's call it 1 in 10, and he didn't stick with it. 1 in 10 times 1 in 10 is 1 in 100. So we're getting down to AA and rehab being, I won't say it's useless, and that God bless anybody who takes those two paths down the road, but somebody's got to deal with the 99% of people who aren't doing those, connecting those two dots. And thankfully, quite a large majority of them do deal with it. Let's get in the mix there and spell out what that process is like.
All right. Well, and this will be a topic for another time. I found this interesting because in our program, the Life Process program, I've worked with people who are newly retired, and they sort of have a shift. They didn't realize how much they valued their work or how much purpose their work was giving them in the context of the rest of their lives. So now they do have a void, and so they've had some issues, but really all they needed to do was go through that stage of development, even if it was a little rocky to get there. They needed to figure out, I was working 8, 9, 10 hours a day. Now I need to decide for myself, what do I want to do to fill those 8 or 9 or 10 hours that's valuable and meaningful? And I think everything that you just said and the point that I just made lends itself very well into the next topic we're going to discuss, which is, one of the topics we'll discuss on a different channel and a different podcast, which is talking about the failure of mental health to produce beneficial outcomes. So if people want to go to that talk, then you can go to the link that I'm providing below, the Stanton Peele's YouTube channel.
Before we do that, I just want to say we've done 3 stories. The woman at night, she needed more constructive activities. Collins having, he lost his drumming gig and his family gig became more complicated. And then there's retirement. All 3 of those things are about surveying your life and creating more positive space. That suggests something that's really going on in a widespread way now. We could call this, how do you deal with the pandemic? A lot of people's life choices have been significantly curtailed by the pandemic. I mean, they're not going to go to hang out at a local club. In some cases, they can't even go to a gym. In some cases, people feel they're not going to go on public transportation or take an airplane. And so in a broader cultural sense, a whole host of individuals are being asked to do what Collins, the woman client, and retirees are asked to do, which is, how do you are a person, you have interests, you have abilities, surveying your life space, how are you going to find new outlets and positive ways to experience the world? And that's a big task that a lot of people are facing, but it's one that many people have done. You've named 3 types, and it's far from insurmountable. It's simply having the confidence and the mindfulness to recognize that that's what your new task in life is.
I don't think I can improve upon that summary. So we should leave it there. And, for people watching, listening, we'll see you next Sunday, unless you want to hear what Stanton has to say to expand on all of those things, in which case we'll see you at Stanton Peele's channel. Stanton, see you soon.
See you soon.